Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting CEN seminar. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Paola Bonifacci. We're very excited to have her here today. Professor Paola is an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Bologna, where she also leads the Learning Disorders Assessment Lab. Her research interests include bilingual development and the analysis of cognitive and learning processes in both bilingual and monolingual populations. She's particularly interested in assessing developmental language disorders and specific learning disorders, among both multilingual populations and monolingual populations. Her work also examines how cognitive, emotional, and environmental factors interact in preschool and school-aged children. And today she will be discussing literacy and math profiles in heritage bilingual children, as well as the role of socioeconomic status. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will address them after the talk. And now I'm going to pass over to you, Paola.
Thank you so much, May, and greetings to all. It is indeed a pleasure to participate in this seminar series and to share with you my research interests. Yes, today I will be talking about literacy profiles in heritage bilinguals and the role of socioeconomic status. So I'm going to share with you my slides. Everything should work, I hope. Okay. So a brief overview of what we are going to talk about today. I will start with a short introduction on heritage bilingualism and some notes on the Italian context and issue in assessment, and a very short overview of the literature about what we know on literacy math profiles in bilingual children. Then I will give you some insights from studies on heritage bilingual children exposed to Italian, and then I will enter into the topic of the relationship between bilingualism and socioeconomic status with some past and ongoing studies. I will conclude with some final thoughts, implications, and challenges. So, I'm sure you already know literature on bilingualism. Here, I just want to set some key points. Now we move within functional definitions of bilingualism, even if there are so many labels for bilingual children with which somehow refer to different types and profile of bilingualism. I will focus on heritage bilingual children, so those children who are exposed in the family context to one or more families' languages that are spoken by individuals belonging to ethnic, cultural, or linguistic groups that are a minority in the society in which they live, obviously compared to the dominant language of the wider community. Some key characteristics of these children are a high variability in spoken languages and linguistic history, and often, even obviously not always, it is the socioeconomic level associated is medium low. Some key points on bilingualism, very shortly. We know that bilingualism is not a risk factor for developmental language disorders and specific learning disorders, and there is evidence of a bilingual advantage, even if nowadays there is somehow a debate on the effect size of this advantage. For sure, we know that bilingualism does not lead to disadvantages. In this interesting paper by Jean Paradis, she highlights a set of sources of individual differences in dual language development of heritage bilinguals. And she identifies internal aspects of the child, so for example, age of L2 acquisition, but also proximal factors such as exposure to L1 and L2, and distal factors, including family SES. So I will move somehow within this model, but with a more clear reference to literacy process rather than language processes. Before starting with the research, I would like to give you some notes on the Italian context. Here is a report on children with non-Italian citizenship prepared by the Ministry of Education and Merit. And obviously, children with non-Italian citizenship, do not fully correspond to heritage bilinguals, but it is like a proxy of an estimate. In Italy, we have had rapid growth of the presence of these children in the mainstream classes in the last 20 years. So it is quite recent, the phenomenon of heritage bilingualism in mainstream classes, although Italy has been a bilingual country for many years, considering the many different dialects that are spoken in each region. The Italian school system is highly inclusive, so all children attend school in mainstream classes. There are still, however, some discrepancies in school attendance, particularly students with non-Italian citizenship have a lesser degree of attendance to preschool and to the final years of high school. So there is a risk, as you can see here, of school dropout. And now we have as a mean value in Italy, 11.2% of students with non-Italian citizenship in the school population. In this graph, you can see the percentage of students with school delay, which means they are not attending the age corresponding grade. For example, in high school, you see that there is a 48% of non-Italian citizenship students who have a school delay, and 26% in secondary school. The good side, if we can find one, is that these percentages are decreasing from the first report in 2017, and we hope that the trend will continue to reduce this discrepancy. So we are faced with a sort of a paradox, because we know that we share a positive view of bilingualism, but some evidence suggests a risk of school underachievement. For sure, there are some societal factors that intervene and that can act as moderators, such as socio-economic status, but also school discrimination, even unintentional, like lack of adequate teaching strategies for multilingual classrooms or biases in evaluation. So when we speak about assessment in bilingual populations, we know that there is a set of good practices for the assessment of language skills in bilinguals. These are defined by international associations and also by a rich literature on this topic. So the main suggestions are to evaluate both languages, to adopt dynamic assessment, and non-exclusive reliance on standardized tests. Also to move within a sociocultural approach involving parents with interviews on the habits at home and also competencies in L1, and the need of developing combined protocols and measures for the identification of disorders. In this paper, a few years ago, we defined a combined protocol for the identification of developmental language disorders in heritage bilingual children for the Italian context. But when we move to the assessment of literacy and numeracy in heritage bilingual children, we face some challenges. For example, it is rarely feasible to assess skills in both languages. I mean, literacy skills in both languages, because few children are schooled in both languages. Also, there are differences in reading and writing systems, so opaque and transparent languages, but also linguistic distance between the heritage language and the societal language. Finally, in primary or secondary school children, we observe a frequent phenomena of progressive heritage language erosion, because the more they enter in contact with schools and friends, often they tend to lose competence in the heritage language. So here I will offer you a very short summary of what we know about literacy and math skills in heritage bilingual children. As regards decoding, we know that word and non-word reading accuracy is typically achieved within 2 years of scholastic exposure, but minor evidence has been collected for passage reading. Regarding reading comprehension, we know that we have 2 meta-analyses that found lower reading comprehension skills in bilinguals. However, scores are around the average range, and the main predictors of reading comprehension are lexical and morphosyntactic knowledge. There is also evidence of a gradual catch-up with the years of schooling. There are less results on spelling and also contrasting evidence. A meta-analysis suggested a bilingual advantage in spelling words, but a disadvantage in spelling non-words. Whereas Lee and Schallert found worse writing skills than reading skills in bilinguals. Finally, regarding math, there are contrasting results for group differences. This area is clearly less investigated than literacy, but we know that there are differences in calculation skills according to language structure and lexicon. So Chinese, German, and Italian and French have different lexical systems for number, and this might have an impact on how we perform mental calculation. And also bilingual tend to perform mental calculation in the language they learned math. So starting from this introduction, I will show you now some insight from studies on heritage bilingual children exposed to Italian. In this study, this was one of our first studies on literacy and bilingualism. We compared the early bilinguals, late bilinguals, and monolinguals in 4th, 5th grade in a set of reading tasks. And we found that late bilinguals were less accurate than early bilinguals and monolinguals in assigning non-dominant stress, particularly for low-frequency words. This somehow shows that bilingual readers are sensitive to the distributional properties of the language. But in this paper, we also highlighted how reading in Italian, when reading in Italian, lexical information seems to be largely employed and influences reading speed. In this second paper, we performed a cross-group comparison with monolingual children with specific learning disorders, monolingual poor comprehenders, early bilinguals, late bilinguals, and monolinguals with typical development in a set of reading tasks. Here you can see that the group of monolinguals with a specific learning disorder, as expected, underperformed compared to the other groups, but there were no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals in on-word reading speed and accuracy and word reading accuracy. However, in word reading speed and passage reading speed and accuracy, and also in reading comprehension, there were some kind of differences. So early bilingual and particularly late bilinguals were slower or less accurate in reading and comprehension tasks. In another study, we compared literacy skills in Italian and English, but in this case, English was foreign language for Italian children, so a second language for Italian children, and like a third language for bilingual children, because obviously we did not include the children who had English as a main language, home language. We compared heritage bilingual children and monolinguals with typical development and monolinguals with dyslexia in a set of reading, writing, and comprehension tasks. Here you find the percentage of children performing below average. So, particularly, I want you to focus on the writing column. Here you see that around 50% of the bilingual sample had below average scores, quite similar to the dyslexia group and very different from the control group. But when these children were asked to do some spelling tasks in English, there was a high discrepancy, and the bilingual group performed very similar to the control group, whereas the dyslexia group had increased the difficulties in spelling in English. So this suggests that this can be considered an apparent spelling disorders, but indeed these children do not have a spelling disorders because in another language they do not have difficulties in acquiring spelling skills. Here there is a summary of results on reading parameters across a set of our and other studies on the Italian context, and you can see that there were no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals in non-word reading speed, and also we can say accuracy. Just one study found a difference. Whereas we had word reading, some contrasting results in word reading and in text reading. Contrasting results were found also in listening and reading comprehension, with some differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. And what about spelling? In this paper that we published this year, here you can see that if we calculate the percentage of children with below average scores, it is around 30% in dictation tasks. This percentage is slightly lower when we consider not dictation tasks, but spontaneous writing tasks, probably because when you write, you tend to choose words that you know better. So you have less spelling errors. And then just a quick note on some math output. As I told you, math is less investigated in bilinguals, at least in terms of group differences in children. Here we we ran a longitudinal study from the beginning of second grade to the end of second grade of primary school, with a set of tasks administered by teachers to children collectively in class. And you can see that there were no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals in symbolic comparison, number line task, written calculation. But there was a significant difference in multiplication tables. In mental calculation and dictation, there was a tendency, but it was not so strong, the effect. It was also nice to see that in approximate calculation tasks, bilinguals at the end of third grade outperformed monolinguals. In approximate calculation tasks, you just have to do some rapid guessing about the result. So, in summary, these data suggested that we need to overcome a one-size-fits-all approach. So there is a need for fine-grained analysis on different subcomponents of literacy and numeracy skills. There are some strengths in the heritage bilingual profile, in reading speed and non-word reading speed and accuracy and non-verbal math tasks, and some weaknesses, particularly in spelling. Also, there are differences between early and late bilinguals. A note on spelling, because it seems something like a counterintuitive result. In highly transparent language, monolinguals usually develop writing skills faster compared to monolingual children learning to write in an opaque language. So the discrepancy between heritage bilingual children and monolinguals might be more pronounced in transparent languages due to the very low percentage of spelling errors in monolinguals. Further, spelling in Italian is strongly influenced by lexical skills. So after this first set of studies in which, we did not directly took into account the role of socio-economic status, now I'm going to show you instead some studies where socio-economic status was included. We know that low SES can negatively impact linguistic competence and nonverbal and cognitive skills. Instead, when we speak about heritage sequential bilingualism, we know that we can find some negative relationship with linguistic competence, but only in L2 for heritage bilinguals, so not linguistic competence in general, but only in the second language. But it should be a protective factor for nonverbal and cognitive skills. There is a set of evidence that evaluated the relationship between bilingualism and socioeconomic status, although not so directly related to literacy output. However, it is always more highlighted the importance, as in this paper on developmental science, the importance of including socio-economic variables in research. So now we move to some kind of some studies on that try to disentangle the role of SES and bilingualism in literacy skills. In the first study, we compared heritage bilingual children with low SES to a group of monolingual children with equal low SES and with a group of monolingual children with high SES. And the main output was that there were no differences in word-on-word and text decoding, but low SES heritage bilinguals underperformed high and low SES monolinguals in spelling tasks and reading comprehension. Instead, as regards listening comprehension, low SES heritage bilinguals and low SES monolinguals underperformed compared to high SES monolinguals. Then we followed this sample up to the 5th grade of primary school, so in a longitudinal study, and here you can find the main results. So here you can see that there were no differences among groups in decoding skills, so word on word and passage reading. It was not significant, although there was a trend, the difference in listening comprehension. Here you can see that the monolingual, the black line is the low SES monolingual, low SES bilingual group, and the low SES monolingual group had similar performance. The high SES monolingual group had a better performance, but this difference was not fully significant. Instead, an interesting results come from the reading comprehension pattern. Here you can see that heritage bilingual children were far below the both monolingual groups in 2nd grade, but in 5th grade, they reached a somehow better performance of monolingual SES group, low SES group, even though they still underperformed compared to the monolingual high SES group. Finally, for spelling, although the bilingual group improved over time, as you can see, they still did not reach the full consolidation of the spelling process and the level of the two monolingual groups. We also conduct a study in the French context with my colleague Stéphanie Bellocchi, in which we compared low and high SES groups of monolinguals and bilinguals. And we found an effect of bilingualism on vocabulary and morphosyntactic comprehension, as well as on passage reading speed, irregular word reading, and non-word spelling. But when we considered the SES effect, it also involved non-verbal IQ and non-word repetition. There were no effects on text reading accuracy, non-word reading, and regular and irregular word reading. So now I'm going to present you some new data from an ongoing project. I mean, the project has finished, but we are working on the results. The AD Lab project, which is conducted in collaboration with different public health services in the Emilia-Romagna region. where they selected the groups of bilingual and monolingual children with a diagnosis of specific learning disorders, and we collected that data on schools for collecting data on the typically developing groups. The main aim of this project were to understand specific learning disorders manifestation in heritage bilingual children, but more generally to then give good practice for assessment to these public health services. We have a branch of the project on developmental language disorder, but I do not have time to show this data in this presentation. So here you can find a different kind of comparison. We compared heritage bilingual and monolingual typically developing groups. What is the question behind this comparison? To develop reasonable expectation on the level of proficiency in literacy skills in heritage bilingual typical developing children, and to understand which kind of norm referenced value to use. Then we compared heritage bilingual children with typical development and monolingual children with specific learning disorder, and the main question was eventual weaknesses in bilinguals overlap with monolingual SLD. Then we compared the two clinical groups to understand if SLD showed similar characteristics, and finally the two heritage bilingual groups to understand which measure better discriminate heritage bilinguals with and without SLD. Regarding the literacy protocol, here you can find inclusion criteria. In the SLD group, we included only children with a diagnosis of reading spelling disorders, and we collected the results on a set of cognitive and literacy tasks, as well linguistic history and SES evaluated through the All-Linked 4-factor index. The total sample was of 403 participants. They were matched for age and nonverbal IQ. Before showing you the results of literacy output, just a window on the linguistic exposure of the two groups of heritage bilinguals. There were no differences in age of first exposure, total length of exposure, and linguistic exposure in heritage language or Italian with mother or father, but the typically developing heritage bilinguals had higher exposure to heritage language in interactions with siblings and also content on television. A similar point is found in these graphs on linguistic dominance. The orange column is referred to the group with specific learning disorders. Here you can see that the clinical group was clearly more dominant in Italian, whereas the typically developing heritage bilingual group was more distributed, and around 40% of these participants were dominant, at least in comprehension, in the heritage language. When we arrived to the SES point, we saw that there was bilingual effect. So the monolingual group, both in the typical and the clinical group, had higher level of SES. Also, and somehow a little bit surprisingly, There was also a diagnostic group effect. So both SLD groups had lower SES compared to the typical groups. Here we have a question point, because this might be for sure interpreted as a sample bias, but it also reflects what usually happens in the society, because these were randomly selected from the public health service. So for sure, here we know, because we evaluated this, that we need to take into account SES. So here there is a summary of results on reading measures, the coding reading measures. And in the first column, you find differences based on diagnostic group differences. As you can see, as a whole, the SLD and TD groups always differ with quite good, effect sizes. Here you find the differences, the bilingualism effect, when SES is not taken into account, and we can see that there were differences in word reading accuracy and text reading accuracy. But when SES is entered as a covariate, then the bilingual effect is no longer present. There were no group interactions. A similar pattern emerged for results on listening and reading comprehension. So, effect of the diagnostic group, a first effect of bilingualism, but when you enter SES, the bilingualism effect disappears. And also in reading comprehension, there is an interaction. So the group of heritage bilinguals with SLD underperformed compared to the monolingual group with SLD, but the typically developing group slightly outperformed the monolingual group. Finally, as for spelling, we found that after controlling for SES, there was still a difference in passage dictation task, with more spelling errors in the bilinguals. I will arrive to a summary in short. Just a quick overview of results on math. In this case, we included children with a clinical diagnosis of math disorder, so it was not the same group as before. And for math tasks, we saw that the only task that remained significant in terms of group differences between bilinguals and monolinguals was number writing. Whereas for number reading, mental calculation, written calculation, the initial differences that, however, had small effect sizes disappeared. There were also interactions, and in this case, only the TD groups differed from monolinguals, but no differences were in the clinical groups. The last point I want to share with you regards a spot on psychological well-being. This study was conducted in preschool age. It has been recently published, And here we compare the heritage bilinguals and monolinguals in the strength and difficulties questionnaire, which I guess you may know. It assesses different areas like emotional problem, conduct problems, ADHD, peer relationship, and as a strength point, pro-social behavior. If we do not take into account SES, you can see that bilinguals seemed to have increased emotional problems, ADHD threats, and peer relationship difficulties. But when we, in this study, we evaluated, so the language background is bilingualism and monolingualism. We evaluated linguistic skills in these children, so their actual linguistic skills, and SES. And we can find that SES was the best predictor of emotional problems together with language background. Linguistic skills was the sole predictor of conduct problems. Linguistic skills and SES predicted impulsivity, hyperactivity traits, and all variables contributed to in the prediction of peer relationship problems, but the dominance analysis showed that linguistic skills had the main effect. Finally, in pro-social behavior, we have a main effect of language background, but it is a positive effect. So bilinguals showed better pro-social skills. So to come to a conclusion, we see, based on our first research question, we can say that regarding reasonable expectations, it depends on the task. Probably we need to give more time to spelling, comprehension, and passage reading. However, the heritage bilingual with typical development has always better performance than monolingual children with specific learning disorders. And there is a similar profile in the SLD phenotype. Even here, bilinguals tend to have worse comprehension and spelling skills. Finally, in all tasks, heritage bilingual with typical development significantly differ from the SLD groups. So, for sure, it is important to offer educational support to everyone who needs educational support, but we need to reflect to the risk of assigning a label of a disorder when indeed we are facing a typical bilingual trajectory. See, for example, the case of spelling errors. Then we need maybe to adopt a different kind of norm reference values because those collected on monolinguals carry a risk of overdiagnosis. Also, we can make some adjustment in evaluation procedures. For example, in Italy, we defined a national guideline with some good practice for the assessment of SLD in bilingual population. I do not have time, and it's not the aim of this presentation, but here we have a decision tree on how to move when we need to diagnose SLD in heritage bilingual population. Regarding the role of SES, once SES is accounted for, many differences disappear. Something remains on spelling, mainly on spelling tasks. However, it is an important point, I think, even covering SES, the differences between the SLD group, the group with specific learning disorders, and the typically developing group remains stable. So SES does not does not impact so much in this kind of comparison. And also, SES, together with linguistic competence, is also involved in psychological well-being, and heritage bilinguals are more pro-social. I think that the main challenges regard how to calculate the weight of socio-economic level in the clinical evaluation, and how to manage language diversity and poverty in the diagnostic process. Also, there is research on that, but it is very important to understand all the possible factors that can mediate the relationship between SES and outcomes, scholastic and well-being outcomes, and also educational policies intervene in this point. Finally, regarding linguistic history, heritage bilingual children with typical development are more frequently engaged in heritage language interaction. So they preserve heritage language more than the group with specific learning disorders. So exposure to the heritage language seems to be a protective factor, whereas children with SLD may be led to reduce the exposure to the use of heritage language, but the literature brings clear evidence on the possibility for children with neurodevelopmental disorder to grow up bilingual. So we need to work with families and with health services to promote a positive view of bilingualism as a protective factor. Implications and challenges are referred to the importance of a careful investigation of linguistic background and competencies in the heritage language, but also we need to remember that bilingualism is a highly dynamic phenomenon, also depending on societal factors. So this pattern of results may change over time. Finally, now I'm working, I am involved in some project assessing family language policy and emotional correlates. Working a lot on bilingualism and bilingual family, we found that there are somehow discrepant information when you ask families to write their linguistic history by filling in a questionnaire, or when you carry on interviews with them, or when you register directly from home their interactions. So sometimes we do not really know what really families do in terms of family policy in their lives. So it is a point worthy of future investigation. I thank you so much for listening to me, and suggestions are very welcomed. Here you can find, if you're interested, some of my research output, and I would really like to thank all past, present, and future colleagues and collaborators. And a special thanks to Silvana Contento, who was my mentor and who introduces me into the topic of bilingualism. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paola, for the fascinating talk, and thank you for joining us. Really interesting results. I would just like to start with a question, then we can go through any questions in the chat once they start to come in. Given the strong predictive relationship that you found between nonverbal intelligence and spelling skills, specifically in bilingual heritage children, compared to monolinguals, and the educational Italian system that is very dependent on Italian, do you think this can be more attributed to the cognitive load when processing language, specifically during reading comprehension or spelling?
No, sorry, I lost the first part of the question, sorry.
Yeah, I was just asking, do you think the nonverbal intelligence, the strong prediction of nonverbal intelligence in heritage bilingual students, do you think this is more related to the cognitive load that is the students experience during reading comprehension or spelling, or the limited exposure to academic vocab or in the Italian context?
Do you refer at the predictors of spelling tasks?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I mean, I think that the role of nonverbal IQ is really more on the cognitive load, indeed. And we also found these results also in another study. I didn't report here the results, but I mean, for when you learn in another language, there is for sure, particularly at the beginning, a mediation of cognitive load. So it is very different from simultaneous bilinguals who learn mainly through implicit processes. So particularly for late bilinguals, or I mean children who are exposed to the school language like at the age of 6, 7, 8 years old, at the beginning the role of the cognitive load is quite important. Then it will going to diminishes in the over time, but I would explain this based on a sort of a cognitive load, hypothesis.
Thank you. We have a request if you could please share the slide with the arrows that shows the interactions and explain the interactions a bit further from Kai Brucato.
Which interactions?
If you can share maybe your slide.
Okay. I think it's
this is, yeah, I think it was one of the previous slides.
No, there are no interactions before. Maybe here?
Maybe, I think. Kai, if you can hear us, can you please let us know which slide you're referring to?
I cannot read the chat. Maybe here there are a lot of interactions which are in the math tasks. And I didn't report too many graphs because, but we found that only the typically developing groups, the heritage bilingual typically developing group had lower scores compared to the monolingual typically developing group. So only children with typical development differed with lower scores in bilinguals math scores, whereas the two clinical groups did not differ in math scores, so their performance was very similar. I don't know if this was the question.
Yeah, she mentions near slide 26, I think SES, if I'm not mistaken, and literacy.
26?
Yes, I think this is the slide. Yes.
Okay. Here we have, indeed, it is not an interaction, but we see that there is an effect of bilingualism on SES. So the bilingual group had lower score compared to the monolingual group, and the clinical group had lower scores compared to the typically developing group. I don't know if it was the question. And then here we have also some data on a working memory index where we have an effect of bilingualism, maybe because this is a verbally mediated task in which you have to remind numbers in the societal language, so in Italian in this case, whereas there were no effects for bilingualism in non-word repetition and speed of processing as measured by the WISC-4 subtest.
Thank you. Professor Thomas is asking which aspects of SES do you think are having an influence?
Yeah, a very good question. Well, I can say that we collected information on mothers and fathers, educational level, and occupation. And we ran some preliminary analysis in order to understand if one of these factors was best predicting literacy. But indeed, the correlation pattern was quite similar among these 4 indices. So there was not a real main predictors. I mean, one factor that explained much more than the others. So this, I think it's first the thing. I know that it's very difficult to evaluate SES, and there are many theories and ways, and so we should include much more variables, but at least we included both parents and both educational and occupational level. Then I think, I think we shouldn't bring a deterministic way of interpreting the role of SES. For sure, we know that there are so many factors that can intervene, but probably, I mean, most of these literacy tasks are based on lexical component. And if you see the main relationship between SES and the tasks I presented you was mainly on the tasks with a higher lexical load. So it may be referred to all the papers by Prof and colleagues who showed that SES can be associated with a less extensive and less rich exposure in the family environment regarding lexical richness, the amount of linguistic interaction, and so on, which can have a cascade effect later on literacy skills.
Thank you very much. I have one last question before we wrap up. Did you have any information or collect any information about the language activities in the family? The amount of reading in both languages, for instance, beside the SES information that was collected?
Yeah, I mean, we did not collect information on home literacy practices, but we collected information. I just reported a little bit on how often the mother speaks to the child in Italian and in the heritage language, the same for the mother, fathers, siblings, TV, and also some question on the dominance. So in which language the child comprehends better or produces better. So we had a quite long interview on habits in the family, but as I told you, sometimes it's difficult to, I mean, these are somehow heterogeneous data.
Thank you very much, Paola. Someone requested if I can share the slides, so I think I will leave your email in case
Sure.
you wish to share the slides. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. If we have no more questions in the chat, I think this brings us to the end of our seminar. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Paola. And we really wish to see you at the next CN seminar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and hope to meet you sometimes.
Thank you. Same.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.